Good morning. This is week 14 of the Introduction to Culture Studies. So, a moment to round up the entire semester and to perhaps go back to the beginning, but in a different way. We started with the definitions of culture, with the concepts of culture and nature. So let's go back to nature and talk a little bit about ecology and culture and a few subjects connected with that. So if we look at the very beginning of the concepts of nature in culture, we encounter the gardens. And generally, if we look at the garden, it is a place between culture and nature. The plants and also animals that inhabit the garden are of course parts of nature. But the arrangement, the care, the design are all products of human intervention and of course culture. If we look at the beginnings of gardening, we of course encounter the very beginnings of our own culture, the mythological stories of the origin of the human world. That is the Garden of Eden. Human story, human civilization, culture, beliefs started in the garden, and ancient civilizations had some famous gardens, like one of the wonders of the ancient world, the Hanging Gardens of Mesopotamia. First gardens, or modern gardens, at least as we know them, were created in Persia. They employed a lot of symmetry in their design. They used water features. Then all ancient cultures, Egypt, Greece, Rome, they all had gardens. Gardens were a status symbol, so everyone who was rich and powerful had their own gardens. They were praised by philosophers and generally considered a very noble hobby for the rich. So unlike relatively low social position of a farmer, so somebody who also worked the land, the garden and the gardener were high in the social position. In the Middle Ages in Europe, we have medicinal gardens with herbs. We have monastic gardens cared for by the communities of monks and nuns. We have vegetable gardens or kitchen gardens practically near every household, near every manor, and they are used on daily basis. There are Renaissance gardens in Italy, the first botanical gardens also in Italy, in Padua in the 16th century. We have the first collection of plants arranged in a botanical garden. We have the first public gardens in Spain. If we look at the history of British gardens and gardening, this is a vast and very interesting history. One of the longest running BBC shows is the gardening program called Gardener's World, which started in 1968 and it's still going. So it's really popular and it has a lot of viewing public. The current host is called Monty Don. You have a picture here. There are also some other aspects of gardening that are typical for English culture, such as the national passion for roses. A rose is the heraldic plant for many British noble houses. Also the royal houses like the Tudors had the rose in their coat of arms. In the modern history, in the 20th century and into the 21st, we have great gardeners creating new types of roses. For example, Austin roses named after the gardener who cultivated them. We have the whole culture of allotments, that is small gardens given by the state to individual people, relatively poorer people, so those who could not afford to have a private garden next to their residence, because they, for example, they did not have a residence. They lived in the city, and still the idea that they should have some connection, some access to nature for exercise, for additional food like the vegetables or herbs they could grow, and also for some sort of mental exercise, for relaxation. So of course, as with everything in culture, we have different styles in gardening. So just as we can have the history of art going through different periods of British culture, it is the same principles that are reflected in the history of British gardening. So what we have are, for example, I'll just give you a few examples, Tudor and Stuart gardens. So in the 16th and 17th centuries, the popularity of hedges and walls and the so-called knot gardens. You have a knot garden here in the photograph. So the very intricate geometric patterns, usually made of small hedges, that are popular and fashionable in this period. We have some political messages encoded in gardening designs, like secret Catholic messages after the Reformation of Henry VIII. The use of triangles to denote the Holy Trinity, like here in this triangular lodge, garden pavilion in Rushton. The popularity of labyrinths and such. We have a great fashion for formal gardens, the Italian and later French style in gardening, which emphasized the control of nature. We have some fashionable plants, such as the topiary, that is the hedges and shrubs that are cut in such a way that they become living sculptures. They have unnatural shapes, but very attractive shapes. Lawns with the lawn mowers. So the idea to have a neat lawn rather than a wild meadow. This is a Stuart idea. Tulips. You may have heard about the tulip mania in 17th century Netherlands. So the speculation and the national hysteria, really, obsession with tulips. Then in the 18th century, in the Georgian period, as you know from the history of art, we have the English landscape garden, which is more natural in style. We have the first great garden designers in England in the persons of Humphrey Repton or Capability Brown. This was his nickname. His real name was Lancelot Brown, but he always talked about the capabilities he saw in the grounds of his clients, so everybody called him Capability Brown. We have all kinds of garden architecture, classicist buildings resembling ancient Greek and Roman buildings, grottos, statues. We have the great popularity of sheep, because they would eat the grass and create lawns. We have some new inventions like the ha-ha, which is like a hidden fence, a hidden wall. So looking from your palace, you don't see a fence. You don't really see a garden wall. It just looks like it's going on forever. But if you go closer to this place, it is a hidden wall, hidden by a slight elevation of land. It was called the ha-ha because then, yes, the joke was on you. In the 18th century, we have the Industrial Revolution with the growth of industry and transportation also the digging of canals. So the landscape of England, especially central and northern England, is transformed through the canals. And then comes the 19th century, the Victorian period, which is the period of industry and empire, and they are all reflected in the gardening styles. In the great popularity of glass houses. One of the designers of glass houses was Joseph Paxton, who designed also the exhibition hall called the Crystal Palace for the Great Exhibition in London in 1851. We have exotic plants brought by plant hunters. So we have special expeditions organized from England to look for fashionable exotic plants for English gardens. We have the growth of botanic gardens, especially Kew Gardens. Here you have the photograph of this huge glass house, Victorian glass house at Kew Gardens. Another famous and wonderful botanic garden is in Edinburgh in Scotland. Plant collections, city parks, gardening magazines. We have explorers, also women like Marianne North. You have here one of the images that she painted during her expedition, showing a passion fruit. We have great fads and fashions, like here we have a special dish to serve or to display a pineapple on a Victorian table for the guests, because it was so exotic and fascinating that everybody wanted to give the guests pineapples for dessert. In the 20th century also a lot of interesting things happen. We have the beginning of the allotments I already mentioned. So the small gardens allotted, so given to the working class people to enjoy gardening, to profit from some vegetables and fruits and herbs that they could grow. We have the great revival of a cottage garden, which is a kind of folk-inspired design that used to be very modest and humble, but in the early 20th century it suddenly became extremely fashionable. So we have designers like Gertrude Jekyll or Vita Sackville West, an artist and a scandalous woman in many aspects, connected with the Bloomsbury group, so the modernists, painters and writers and intellectuals. She was a garden designer, and her garden in Sissinghurst was her best creation. During the Second World War, we have the so-called Victory Gardens, that is small allotments used for growing additional food, usually root vegetables, nothing fancy, in the cities. So places like Hyde Park in London was transformed into those Victory Gardens. So it is like small allotments for growing more food during the war. And nowadays, at the end of the 20th century, the beginning of 21st century, what we have is a completely globalized and modern, postmodern industry of gardening, with mass production of plants, with some new inventions like the rooftop gardens in the city, very popular in London. So as you can see, it's always that every aspect of culture corresponds to other aspects of culture. Culture is integrated. Culture is always a whole. So what we can find, except for this sort of historical overview, are some interesting subjects, cultural subjects to explore, connected with gardens and gardening. For example, Was gardening ever controversial, especially gardening and interest in botany by women? Yes, it was in the 18th century. There was a new system of classification of plants introduced by Linnaeus, so it's called the Linnaean system of classification, and it was based on the reproductive organs and the reproductive models of the plants. So gardening, that was a modest and unassuming pastime for ladies, suddenly became sexy and controversial, and you have those women looking at the genitals of plants, and especially the illustrators from the 18th century, like this wonderful woman called Mary Delaney, and this is one of her illustrations. It's not a drawing, it's actually paper cuts. She cut elements of paper and glued them to the background, and here we have one of the plants she illustrated in this way. The 18th century, the late 18th century. In the 19th century, of course, we have those explorers like Marianne North, who were also quite controversial, because a woman going on a scientific trip to exotic places to paint plants, this was something quite unusual. Another interesting subject connected with nature and gardening and so on is the concept of the rural idyll. This goes back to Romanticism, to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, his ideas of return to nature as a remedy to all the moral ills of the modern world. And in the 19th century, after the Industrial Revolution, this gave rise to the great nostalgia for the pre-industrial world, like the lost Garden of Eden, before all the industry, before all the modernity and pollution of the modern world. What we have is the connection of the landscape and the beauty of the English landscape with patriotism. This is actually, here you have one of the postcards that were printed during the Second World War, with one slogan, with one motto: "Your Britain, fight for it now." And it showed the sweet rural scenes of country life, with the purpose of encouraging men to join the army. Mostly men from the industrial cities who never walked those pretty hills like this shepherd here in the postcard, but they had in their minds the ideal land, the ideal rural land. Later, in the second half of the 20th century, we have the whole genre of movies called heritage movies, like Howard's End here, with you have the poster of the cover of the film, and so with Emma Thompson and Anthony Hopkins, so great actors, showing a different kind of idyll. This is the kind of idealized world of the aristocrats and the country houses, the palaces of the aristocracy. So not only about patriotism and the pre-industrial nostalgia, but also the social world that changed and was different. Some more ideas, for example, tourism. Something that started as instruction for the sons of aristocracy in the 18th century, the Grand Tour, and like many things, including gardening, developed into a multi-million-dollar global business. We have some data here about people traveling abroad. 1 million before the Second World War. 650 million in 2000. This year perhaps it's a bit stunted, but we will see what happens then. But because, well, just before the global pandemic, it was through the roof. Tourism was everywhere. And actually, we can talk about the difference between tourism and travel. Travel is something that was always treated as very positive. So travel, as you remember, was the way to counteract prejudice. As Mark Twain said, travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry and narrow-mindedness. Go out into the world, see other cultures, meet other people. It will broaden your mind. It's a very positive thing. But tourism became a mass business, increasingly dismissed as stereotypical and not authentic. There are some movements opposing mass tourism, not individual travel, but mass tourism. It's called Coca-colonization of native cultures. So just interesting, exotic elements of cultures are taken for the pleasure of the mass tourist. We have the general westernization and globalization of the world resulting from mass tourism. And in some places, like in Venice, the locals don't like those tourists who come by big boats and they actually crowd the historical cities. They do not stay, they do not really use the local businesses because everything is provided on the cruise boat. And as one protester probably wrote here on the wall, your luxury trip, my daily misery. Yes, if your city is beautiful and historical and regularly gets crowded by thousands of people who just walk around and return, they do not bring any business, they do not really add anything to the city, and you have to live your daily life there, it's difficult. Another concept, the concept of non-places connected with nature and culture. This is taken from the book by Marc Augère from 1995, Introduction to the Anthropology of Supermodernity. And non-places are the liminal places. This is a very interesting and very important word for culture studies. Liminality, it's taken from the Latin root meaning the threshold. It's something in between, the middle stage, something disorientating because it's kind of hard to pinpoint like where we are. And the non-places are such spaces which are in between, like airports, train stations, supermarkets, motorways, hotels. They are created by globalization, and they are strange, they confuse, because they are not concerned with history, relations, identity. Nobody really travels to see stations or airports or hotels or motorways. They are in between. They are, of course, necessary as the infrastructure, but how do you react to them? Why are they identical everywhere in the world? So as you can see, quite a lot of things happen here, and they are quite interesting, and we continue in a moment.